Welcome to our 17th episode of Two Tankers and a Cat. We're your host, Charlie.
And this is Russell.
Well, we're going to go out with some announcements, but I think the first thing I want to bring up is, listen, if anybody knows anyone in North Dakota, get them to download at least one of our podcasts. North Dakota is now the only state in the United States that does not have any downloads. We've got everybody else except North Dakota.
Wow.
And most people are like, well, nobody lives in North Dakota.
Yeah.
So if you know somebody...
Surely there's an oil man or something up there that'll get bored. And
I'm hoping one of our semi-truck drivers will just pull in and just download it from there.
That'd work too.
Russ, I know we're international now. What are we looking towards, our numbers in the United States, Canada?
Yeah, as of right now, still the United States has got the most downloads at about 1,400. Canada and the United Kingdom's kind of going back and forth, about 170, 185 apiece in that area. Big country that people's downloaded from is Australia, believe it or not. Kind of interesting that we have a following in Australia.
We can always count on the boys down under.
Well, you're darn right.
What about Germany?
Yeah, and in fifth place comes Germany. About 29 downloads so far from them. So they're about the
excellent
fifth most downloaded country.
Well, I know some of our listeners, English is their second language. And for you guys to tune in and listen to us, we really appreciate it. And I know we've been getting comments, well, we tune in because we want to listen to your accents. And I'm like, we ain't got accents.
Whoa.
You got accents.
We've got hick accents, I think is what they consider us here in this part of the United States.
Yeah, a little hillbilly running through us.
Yeah.
Hey, Russ, tell us about the Patreon page.
Yes, folks, don't forget about our Patreon page. You can get to it at www.patreon.com/twotankersandcat. Once you get to Patreon, all you have to really do is I think you can search for Two Tankers and Cat, and our page will come up, and please check that out. And if you can support us, feel free to check out the extra content. We're adding stuff all the time to that. And believe it or not, we're actually getting ready to go on a couple trips, I think. And we will add most of that content, special content, to our Patreon page. And our patrons will have access to that. We do have the 3 different levels of giving. Yeah, we've got the M3 Stuart level. I believe it's at $2, and you actually get the special content there. We've also got a couple other levels. The M4 Sherman level, I believe it's at $4 a month, and the M1 Abrams level is at about $8 a month. So we would truly appreciate any support that you guys could give. And
the main thing I wanted to say is the people that are at the M1 Abrams level, if we're in your area, we'll meet up with you, and lunch is on us. And believe me, me and Russ know how to eat.
Yes, we do.
So we get in your neck in the neighborhood, you definitely want to come up and let us buy you lunch.
Yeah.
And we'll sit around and have a great lunch, and we'll tell you all about tanks that you got questions about.
And I do know that here pretty quick we'll probably be in the Indiana area is what we're kind of looking at, and we'll keep everybody posted on that and where we're at.
And definitely that'll be all over Facebook. We're going to try to do some live stuff from there, and we're going to try to do some drone footage from there for our Patreon. One of the other things people have noticed is we've started streaming some war games, War Thunder, World of Tanks, World of Airplanes, Armored Warfare, just all the basically digital tank, platforms that they have out there. And we're going to start streaming those either on Thursday, Friday, maybe even Saturday nights. Russ will take one night, I'll take one night, or I'll do 1 week, he'll do 1 week. And basically, if you're a Patreon user, we'll give you our Discord, and you can come in and platoon with us.
Sweet.
And play War Thunder. We'll play whatever you want to play.
Oh, yeah.
You know what? We'll even stream Hearts if you're like, listen, I don't want to do any games. I just want to sit around and talk tanks and play Hearts. I'm like, oh, we can do that too.
There we go. Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to Josiah Hensley. Got a couple of emails from him, and he's actually wanting to platoon with us on World of Tanks. He's also interested in the Discord channel. We're still in the process of getting that set up 100%, and more than likely that'll be for our Patreon users and for our patron. That kind of gives us a little support there. But yeah, I mean, glad to hear from Josiah and his interest in tanks. I mean, he's real happy we're doing this podcast, and
I think, Josiah, don't hold us to this, but I don't think you need to join Patreon. I mean, if you want to, great, but I think we'd like to platoon with you because you sound like a pretty cool guy.
yeah.
Who else do we got there, Russ?
Yeah, I also want to give a shout out to John McCauley. He's actually from Ayrshire, Scotland, believe it or not. Across the big pond there.
I bet we killed that.
Oh, I'm sure I did, yes.
Ayrshire.
Ayrshire.
Boy.
If you want to message us back, John, go ahead and tell us how it's pronounced, because we're just a couple of hick Americans. And
Yep. Poor old John's going to say, listen, I'm going to need you to come to the Bovine Tank Museum so I can take a swing at Charlie. You know what? Everybody knows Charlie kills the names on everything. But he plays on the EU server?
Yeah, I believe he does. Plays World of Tanks on the EU server.
You are in luck. I have an EU account, and I'll be more than happy to play.
Sweet.
I got up to tier 8 in that. So we're going to get John, and we'll platoon some and have some good times. He was talking about the Russian flying tank in World War II, the IL-2. And I actually have that on my World of Warplanes.
Oh, sweet.
So we're going to do an episode on flying tanks.
Yeah.
I want to do the Warthog, the IL-2, and there's a bunch of other anti-tank aircraft that you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of thinking we could put the Apache helicopter in there.
Probably put that one in there,
and the
too.
Hind.
Yes, we could.
Because we do like the Russian Hind. Okay, there's a lot of people that live in our in some of our listening area that are like, you would not like the Hind helicopter if it was flying over your town. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. John also sent us a picture of his tank dog.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet there. Yeah,
it's a brown lab.
Looks like a brown lab, and the name's Cooper. Spelled a little bit different than normal, but yeah.
Coupar.
Yeah.
Cooper. Boy, we're going to kill that.
Oh, hey.
He says it's named after a town in up north of him in Scotland, and it's Cooper Angus. And I'm like, okay, we just killed that name too.
I'm sure we did.
That's why people tune in.
They're
sitting there going, wow, these hicks are terrible.
A couple of dumbasses that can't even pronounce anything.
Now, you said on our Patreon, our first level was Stuart. You want to talk about the Stuart tank today?
Well, I might as well.
All right.
I believe it's the next one on the list, isn't it?
All right. Okay, to start off, I would like to say we will be covering the M5 Stuart today, a tank we love. It is actually an upgrade from the M3 Stuart. I personally dislike the U.S. M3. Everybody says, well, is there that much difference between the M3 and M5? Yeah, not much. The same guns. It's just, I have history with the M5. I've got to actually stand on top of the M5 as it was rolling. I think someday that me and Russ might invest in a Stuart, an M5, and do parades and stuff like that, so we can actually have our very first tank. So we won't be digital tankers anymore.
That would be nice.
But like most U.S. tanks, we improved and upgraded our stuff, and it went on to have a really long service record. In fact, the M5A1 variants in other countries, it was in use up till 1996. So, Russ, start us off about the Stuarts.
Yeah, the Stuarts were the first American crewed tanks to engage in combat in World War II. The first version, designated M3, went into production in 1941. Yeah, it was named after the Civil War Confederate General Jeb Stuart. The tank was designed for speedy scouting as an infantry support weapon. An improved version of the vehicle with a revised hull eventually was designated the M5 Stuart. Make sure you check out our 2018 Halloween episode, where you can actually learn a little more about the Haunted Tank comic book series. I kind of wanted to throw that in there to kind of say that, we've already talked about the Stuart a little bit in a past episode there.
And if you haven't heard the Halloween episode, basically we just talk about the Ghost Division that was down there with Patton. And we talk about the actual comic book, the Haunted Tank series. And that's actually kind of fun. If you haven't read any of those comics, you should.
Never thought there'd ever be a tank comic book, but there's been a few issues out there. But getting back to the M3 Stuart, both the M3 and M5 carried a 37 millimeter cannon, which was by most accounts underpowered for combat with German tanks. As a result, Stuarts were often limited to secondary roles. Though not everyone was displeased with the small tank's shortcomings, crews began calling the reliable and fast Stuart Honey, after a proud British driver remarked of the vehicle, "She's a honey."
Well, I'll tell you what, the M5 is a wonderful tank, and I think I had problems with the M3 for the simple fact that when I consider tanks should fight against tanks, and the Stuart was actually, like you said, a scout and anti-infantry. I'm like, it couldn't kill a tiger, And like, well, it wasn't meant to. A lot of these soldiers, even the British, loved it because it drove so well, and there wasn't a lot of German tank action in certain areas.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of machine gun nests, and these Stuarts, they could machine gun these Stuarts all day long, and they just drive up there and use their 37 and wipe them out.
Wow.
And in the Pacific, we're going to talk about a little bit about like that. But go ahead, Russ.
Yeah, the M5s fought in the last phases of North Africa through the invasion of Italy, France, and into Germany. In the Pacific, both Army and Marine Corps units operated M5s, which were more even match to lighter, smaller Japanese tanks and armored cars.
Right. And the the interesting thing about the Stuart in the Pacific, even though it only had a 37 millimeter gun, it was doing really well against Japanese tanks.
Yeah.
Now, some people will bring up, and we'll talk about this later, about the Stuart's first encounter in the Philippines, and we'll talk about that later in the episode. But yeah, it's just an amazing tank. One of the things I found amazing about it, the M3 had an airplane motor.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. So when you listen to the actual M3 that actually has the airplane motor in it, it actually kind of sounds really effective.
Be kind of unique, yeah.
But who thought of that?
Wow,
let's get a light tank and put
an airplane motor in it.
Yeah.
Dang.
But after the war started really kicking up and they needed the airplane motors, then they just put in a Cadillac motor. And if there's anything I know how to fix, it's Cadillacs. I've had a bunch of Cadillacs in my life, so I'm like, hey, if we ever get a tank, let's make sure and get a Stuart because I can work on that engine.
The Stuart was also a Lend-Lease tank to the Soviet Union. Soviet M3s, along with the M3 Lee, the M3 Half-Track, the M3 Stuart, was sent via Lend-Lease to the Soviets, with just under 1,000 units of the light tank being received by the Soviets.
Now, I know the M3 wasn't really liked by the Soviets. They were more interested in getting the big tanks. They were like, we really don't need to scout because we're pushing.
Yeah. The M3s received by the Soviet Union were from various production series identified from their turrets. Early shipments featured tanks with the D38976 welded turret. Following this, they would have the D58101 turret, with later deliveries featuring the D58133 turret. So they actually was designated by the three different turrets that they received on them.
Well, how did the Soviets designate the tank?
The Soviets designated the tank as an M3L.
Which the L was just for light.
For light, yeah.
Okay. Like I said, it was not especially liked by the Soviets so much that they actually sent them to the Manchurian front. They were dealing with some of the Japanese and stuff like that. And if you think about it, they got almost 1,000 of these, and they're like, these are really effective
Yeah.
in the terrain down there along the Manchurian front, and they're really capable of handling Japanese infantry and Japanese tanks. Some of the criticisms the Soviets had include the weak armor and weaponry. The narrow tracks were not suited for the Russian winter or muddy autumn. The flammable high-octane non-standard aviation fuel, that could be a huge problem too.
I could just imagine with the aviation fuel, yeah.
Yeah, and like we were saying, to relieve wartime demand for the radial aero engines used in the M3, a new version was developed using twin Cadillac V8 automobile engines, and the twin hydromatic transmission operating through the transfer case. So the Stuart was a good tank for certain areas.
Yes.
And it was meant for scouting and anti-infantry and stuff like
go.
that, or smaller tanks like your Japanese. But when you get into Stalingrad in the deep snow, it wasn't made for that.
I know. I could see that.
And against these other, Panzer IIIs with the high velocity 50 cal, and then you got the Panzer IVs, they were trying to fight these German Panzers, and they weren't made for that. But when they got down to the Manchurian front, they were like, oh, hey, these are fast, and they don't break down, and they're reliable. These are honeys. It's just where you're deploying that tank.
There you go. Yeah, it had its purpose. I mean, like you said, for infantry support and scouting. The version with the Cadillac automobile engines, it was actually a quieter version, I guess you'd say. A little bit cooler and actually roomier inside the tank. And the automatic transmission also simplified crew training. So that version had a auto transmission.
I hate using the terminology peasants, but that's the terminology that history uses. That these were Russian farmers. They weren't familiar with tractors. They're doing like plows and hard hand dug tools. So when they get in these Shermans, they're easy to drive.
Yeah.
In the right area, in the right place, this is a great tank.
Exactly. Keep it simple, pretty much. I mean, and that's what they tried to do.
And one of the things I've always criticized about the Stuarts, even when they upgraded to the M5, they kept the 37 millimeter gun. And how many times have I talked about, the 37 was at the beginning was okay.
Yeah.
But they upgraded, even went from the M3 to the M5. And
just kind of left behind during the war. I mean, it was just, they needed to upgrade a lot sooner.
At least put a 50 cal,
at least.
A 50 millimeter gun on at least high velocity. Did I ever tell you, I hate the 37 millimeter gun. Even the German general, Heinz Guderian, hated the gun. But since they were laying around, they had to use them. And people say, wait a minute, you're talking about Heinz Guderian. He goes, yeah, the Panzer III that we just did the episode on it, he told them, don't put that 37 millimeter gun.
Didn't want anything to do with it, yeah.
So he went to Hitler, and even Hitler said, oh my God, don't use the 37. And he told them, and they ignored him. Yeah, they're like, well, we got him, so we're going to use him. So if you got Heinz Guderian and Hitler coming to your, sending you letters, don't put them on there, and you keep putting them on there.
I don't know what else you can do, really.
I don't know. Go ahead, Russ. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the M5 gradually replaced the M3 in production from 1942, and after the M7 project proved unsatisfactory, was succeeded by the light tank M24 in 1944. Total M5 and M5A1 tank production was right around 8,885, and an additional 1,778 M8 75 millimeter howitzer motor carriages And that was based on the M5 chassis with an open top turret, were also produced.
You know, again, we just talked about a tank, the M7 project, and it was meant to replace all that. And the M7 was just a failure, and that's just another tank down
I know.
we're going to have to talk about down the future.
You're right.
Well, let's talk about the second point. And the second point is something that me and Russ really enjoy. We're going to talk about this part of why I love the M5 Stuart, and it has a special place in Russ's heart. We're going to talk about the Satan Zippo tank. Russ, go ahead and start us off with that.
Yes, it's very interesting. I hope you folks out there find it interesting too. One of the Stuart variants was a flamethrower tank called the Satan. About 40 Ronson flamethrower units were shipped to the Central Pacific early in 1944 after they were requested by famous Lieutenant General Holland Howling Mad Smith of the 5 amphibious corps.
Yeah, you gotta love a general that has the nickname Howling Mad.
Howling Mad, that's new to me.
Could you imagine, Howling Mad on there? He goes, "Hey, listen, I got 40 Ronson flamethrowers. These 37 millimeter guns, I take them off and put on flamethrowers." So you can see where this is getting good.
I'd just like to know the story about how I got that nickname myself. Might have to look at that.
You know what? That'd be a good listener question.
It would. It really would.
If you know why Howling Mad got his name, please send us a comment and we'll give you a shout out.
Fill us in here. In the Central Pacific, the flamethrower unit tanks actually took part in demonstrations for the heads of the respective services. So impressed was Howling Mad Smith that he approved the equipment. The Ronson was mounted in the turret of the mothballed, obsolete M3A1s, and to mount the weapon, the 37 millimeter gun main armament was removed.
Good.
Exactly, yes. The mantlet was retained, but a wide tube was introduced into the void left by the absent gun barrel to protect the flame projector.
Oh, okay. So they've kept the gun mantlet and the armor and everything. Basically, they're just sticking out a tube now.
Yeah, stuck a tube out to and it just protected the flame projector.
Did they keep the machine guns?
The coaxial machine gun was retained on the right side of the flame aperture, though some vehicles did have their bow machine guns deleted.
I can understand that.
Yeah.
Because, the leaking stuff. Yeah, I can understand that. But you still have your coaxial right next to the...
Exactly.
Yeah, you're still laying down some serious fire with that 30 caliber.
On the inside of the tank, a huge 170-gallon fuel tank was introduced to give the weapon as much burn time as possible.
170 gallons?
170-gallon fuel tank. Wow.
That'll light your cigar for your people.
Oh, man. Light a few at a time, probably.
How long did it shoot out? I mean, what was that?
The flame projector had a range of up to about 80 yards. So almost an entire American football field.
Wow. And again, we're using yards, and we should do millimeters. Somewhere I can hear our friend Craig Moore and our rest of our UK's kicking us.
We apologize now.
Well, did it have any unfortunate side effects?
Yeah, this particular flamethrower conversion had an unfortunate side effect. The piping connected the projector to the fuel tank limited the turret traverse to 180 degrees left and right.
Oh, so it couldn't use the turret all the way around.
Yeah, because of all the...
But when you're kicking out 80 foot of flaming death...
180 degrees is still quite a bit of traverse.
And there's not anything that's going to get on fire and run behind you, and if it's on fire, you don't care.
And actually, with all this coming together, the M3A1 Satan was born.
Now, how many did they finally make of these?
In total, 24 of these improvised flamethrower tanks were produced by Army and Navy mechanics on Hawaii in time for the Marianas operations. These new tanks were formed into dedicated flamethrower companies in the Marines' 2nd and 4th Tank Battalions.
Okay, so we've talked about the 2nd and 4th Tank Battalions, how they actually fought Japanese tanks and stuff. But they brought these Stuarts up, and these Japanese soldiers would build these concrete bunkers, and they would hide in caves and build these other earth, storage areas and stuff like that where they could put their ammo and machine guns and basically tunnels. And here comes this Stuart, and it just shoots flames straight down the cave.
I know.
And that,
But you got to think, though, at the time, you got to give credit to Howling Mad Smith that he saw a need for this.
Yeah.
And they probably did see a need to get in there with some type of a flamethrower tank.
When you think about having an 18-year-old Marine having to charge a concrete bunker that's covered with machine guns to get close enough to throw a hand grenade in,
Yeah.
you're losing good
wow.
people when you can just drive this flamethrower right
Yeah,
up to the front
yeah.
and just hose them, because they can machine gun this thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's going to be enough armor on them to keep the machine gun bullets from ammunition from actually penetrating.
So how many did each battalion get?
The vehicles were shared between the two battalions with 12 Satans each. The battalions received 3 new M5A1 light tanks each to provide gunnery support for the flamethrowers.
Now, this is a great idea.
Yeah.
So each battalion gets 12. They had 24. So they've split them up evenly. And then they give them 3 of these M5A1 Stuarts to help them go through the jungles, through the sand, and give them actual gun support, with the 37 millimeter gun, and help protect these, because their turrets can turn 360.
Sure.
Okay, so they're so valuable to the Marines and everything. They're like, listen, we're going to assign a regular Stuart tank to protect that.
A darn good idea.
Yeah.
The Satans saw their first action on June 15th, 1944, during the landings on Saipan. The tanks were seldom deployed all at once, often being fielded 4 tanks at a time with gunnery support from one M5A1.
They love these Satan tanks so much that they're deploying its own tank to protect them.
Yeah.
That has to say something. These Marines are like, wow. I hate to say it, the Marines commanders probably weren't really familiar with this. Kind of tell us about that.
Yeah, the Marine commanders were not well versed in the concept of flame tanks, and as such, the Satan was probably not used as much as it could have been.
Well, these Marines aren't really armored experts.
Yeah, at that point in time, yeah.
And here's the general saying, hey, listen, here's 4 of these, but they get their own tank to protect them. And they're like, ooh, the general doesn't want to lose any of these. Maybe we don't want to deploy them. So they don't know how good these things are at first. After the bitter fighting of the initial days of the assaults, the commanders soon learned of the Satan's effect. Tell us a little bit about that.
They were used in great numbers clearing Japanese cave defenses and mop-up operations until the declaration that Saipan was secured on the July 9th of 1944.
Now, we talked about, they'd get in these caves and they barricade themselves up. And instead of charging Marines up there to go in and get these guys who are not coming out, they can just drive the Stuart straight up there and flame it.
I'm telling you.
And what
darn good idea.
Yeah, saving Marines' lives. In mop-up, they would sometimes bypass machine gun nests and stuff like that because they knew that machine gun nest wouldn't pick up.
Sure.
So they'd mark it on the map and tell the flame units to come up.
Sure.
They'd just hose them down. I can't believe that thing carried 170 gallons of fuel.
Incredible.
Of napalm, I guess, or flamethrower fuel. Go ahead and tell us a little bit more.
The Marines developed a standard operating procedure when attacking Japanese bunkers or cave defenses. They would have supporting Sherman M4A2s that would actually crack open the bunker with round after round of high explosives. The Satan would then hose the area with flame, followed by infantry assault squads that would finish up the job.
What they're talking about is you get a big concrete bunker or a cave defense, and they bring a Sherman up with the 105 or 75 shooting HE or high explosive rounds, and just blow them out of the water. Make big old holes in their defenses, And then they'd have the Satan come up there and shoot
Just hose them.
this 80,
Yeah.
80 yards of flame everywhere. And then they'd say, okay, infantry can move up after everything's burned. And they're like, okay, this is clear. There's nothing here now.
It'd be interesting to know how many times they could actually use it with a 170-gallon tank. I don't know if there's anything out there about that or not.
So they tested them out in Saipan. And then the Marines and the commanders that were using it are radioing back saying, holy crap, these things are great. Send them all here. Wow, Russ. We haven't went over the Stuart stats. I just looked at our thing. We haven't done the stats. Go ahead and give us the stats.
The designer was the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. The manufacturers of the Stuart was the American Car and Foundry Company, the Cadillac Division of General Motors, and Massey Harris.
Now, that's a name you don't hear very
That is
often.
something. You know where that actually comes from, though?
No.
They were producers of tractors
Really?
in the United States. And I don't know if they still produce tractors today. I know when I was a kid, I remember at one point they called them Massey Ferguson, I believe. They went in with another company. But, yeah, they've been around for years.
So when were they produced?
The Stuarts were produced between 1941 and 1944, with about 22,744 of them built.
So about 23,000 of these were built. Wow. No wonder we can still find them today.
Exactly. That's what I was getting ready to say. They're kind of popular amongst the reenactors, I guess you would say, here in the United States. And transport. No, I guess they're easily transported compared to some of the bigger tanks, but.
So your reenactors and stuff know that they can put these on a trailer and just bring them down the road.
Sure.
I know the M3 and the M5 have similar specifications. They change a little bit. But why don't you give us the M5A1's production or specifications? Do the late production one.
Yeah, the mass of these things were about 33,500 pounds, and that comes out to about 15.20 metric tons. The length is about 4.84 meters, and that comes out to about 15 foot and 10.5 inches. And that was with the sand shields and rear stowage box added on it too.
Oh, okay.
The width of the Stuart, about 2.29 meters, or about 7 foot 6 inches wide, and that was with the sand shields also.
Gotta have the sand shields.
Exactly. Keep that sand out of there.
What kind of crew did it have?
It had a crew of 4, had a commander, a gunner, a driver, and an assistant driver.
Now, the assistant driver was also the bow gunner.
Gunner.
Okay. Okay, what kind of armor does this thing have?
Well, it had armor ranging from about 9.5 millimeters clear up to 63.5 millimeters, and that translates into 0.375 to 2.5 inches thick of armor.
So when they're attacking from the front, they've got about 2.5 inches or 63.5 millimeters of frontal armor. So, okay, that's definitely going to stop your small arms fire.
Sure.
Even a grenade, that'll stop.
Yeah.
Right next
2.5 is quite a bit for a smaller tank like that. I'm not sure how that compares to some of the others, but...
Now, I know the main armament is what we've been complaining about. It was a 37 millimeter gun, and they actually carried like 147 rounds of that.
That's quite a few.
What was their secondary armament?
They also had 3 30 caliber or 7.62 millimeter Browning M1919A4 machine guns, and they carried right around 6,700 rounds of that ammunition with them.
That is a rolling machine gun nest right there.
It is.
You know, and that's what it was really meant for. You know, if you got infantry troops out there, they're like, hey, we got a little cluster, of troops down in a foxhole or something. The tank could roll up there, machine gun it, and throw a 37 round in it. All right. And we already talked about the twin engines, the Cadillac series. So if you need your Cadillac engine worked on, I'll do that on the side.
I don't know if I'd trust him, but you can try it.
What was the power and weight ratio?
Yeah, the power weight ratio was about 14.48 horsepower per metric ton. It had a Hydromatic 4-speed forward transmission and it had one reverse
Nice.
gear.
What kind of suspension did it have, though?
It had a vertical volute spring suspension, or the VVSS.
Oh, you know what? That's a good suspension. What was the fuel capacity for that thing, though?
It carried about 74 imperial gallons, 340 liters, or about 89 U.S. gallons.
Well, we would call it 89 gallons. What kind of operational range would that thing have?
It would usually get out to about 100 miles.
Or 160 kilometers?
160 kilometers, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like my Cadillac.
Yeah.
You put in 89 gallons, you'll be lucky to get 100.
Have to figure out the...
That's not real good. It's maybe 1 point something per mile per gallon. But what kind of speed are we talking about?
They would do about 36 miles an hour or about 58 kilometers an hour on the road.
So these are fast.
Not bad compared to some of the smaller tanks we've talked about in the past. I mean, huge improvement.
So they're fast rolling machine gun nests. You know, you got 3 different Browning machine guns racing through.
Tons of ammunition to go along with it, too.
I'm getting more and more impressed with this
I
Stuart.
know.
So basically, like we said, it's a fast reconnaissance vehicle to support infantry. Well, with a honey of a ride. You know, the other saying, it was a honey.
It was a honey.
Okay, Russ, take us through its combat history in World War II.
Yeah, a little bit of the combat history of the Stuarts in North Africa from mid-November 1941 to the end of the year. About 170 Stuarts, in a total force of over 700 tanks, took part in Operation Crusader during the North African campaign, with poor results.
No, we've kind of talked about Operation Crusader. That was mostly a British or UK against... That's basically before we really the Americans got into it. Like I said, against the Panzer III, it wasn't really meant to be a tank versus tank.
No.
And that's what they were trying to use it for. But like we were saying, it was great for what it was supposed to be doing.
This is despite the fact that the M3 was superior or comparable in most regards to most of the tanks used by the Axis forces. The most numerous German tank, the Panzer III Osif G, had nearly identical armor and speed to the M3 Stuart, and both tanks' guns could penetrate the other tank's front armor from beyond 1,000 meters, or 3,300 feet.
So it was comparable.
Pretty close matchup,
to the Panzer III. They just weren't using it the way it should have been used.
Yeah, exactly.
And we're going to talk about Operation Torch, when the Americans very, very first got in there and they went after Rommel. And if you haven't studied that, you might want to look into that. That was a disaster because they did not know what to do with their tanks. To make a long story short, Germans had set up 88s camouflage and told the Shermans and the Stuarts, hey, go charge that.
Oh, man.
Yeah, you can imagine what
Interesting, yeah. The most numerous Italian tank and second most numerous Axis tank overall, the Fiat 1913-40, was much slower than the Stuart, had slightly weaker armor all around, and could not penetrate the Stuart's front hull or turret armor at 1,000 meters, whereas the Stuart's gun could penetrate any spot on the M13/40.
So the designers and stuff are saying, no, you guys don't understand. They'll stand face to face with these Panzer IIIs, and they'll definitely kill these Italian tanks, no problem. But the commanders were using them wrong.
Although the high losses suffered by Stuart-equipped units during the operation had more to do with the better tactics and training of the Afrika Corps than the apparent superiority of German armored fighting vehicles used in the North African campaign. The operation revealed that the M3 had several technical faults. Mentioned in the British complaints were the 37mm M5 gun and poor internal layout. And once again, the 37mm gun, we've already
They're like, we're not happy
showed
with
our
it.
dislike about it already. So
And they had it laid out wrong.
laid out wrong. The two-man turret crew was a significant weakness, and some British units tried to fight with three-man turret crews.
Yeah.
Tried to add the extra man.
Yeah, for a loader and
Well,
everything.
sure.
You know, you're in the fight. It's time to throw rounds. They're like, hey, get up here. And he's like, it's all cramped. Oh, we don't care. Get in here.
The Stuart also had limited range, which is a severe problem in the highly mobile desert warfare, as units often outpaced their supplies and were stranded when they ran out of fuel.
Well, we've talked about it had about 100 miles worth of range, and these guys are out there speeding across, and they're burning fuel.
Outpaced their fuel supply.
And they just sat there, and if you're out of gas, you're
a sitting duck.
Yeah.
Man.
So, again, like everybody's saying, it wasn't the Stuart's fault. It's not the fault of the tank. It's just bad tactics and superior tactics from Rommel. I mean, let's face it, Rommel knew what he was doing, tactical, in the war, and these guys were running out of gas, and they were sitting there.
Man.
Bad idea.
But on the positive side, Cruise liked its relatively high speed and mechanical reliability, especially compared to the Crusader tank, which comprised a large portion of the British tank force in Africa until 1942. The Crusader had similar armament and armor to the Stuart, but while being slower, less reliable, and several tons heavier.
We've talked a little bit about the Crusaders and how they were breaking down.
They had their issues.
That they had their issues. The UK forces are like, hey, these are honey tanks. They're running great and everything. They suck gas.
Yeah.
But, we kind of like them. They're faster and they don't break down as much. So they're wanting them, but they're kind of using them the wrong way.
The Stuart also had the advantage of a gun that could deliver high explosive shells. HE shells were not available for the QF 2-pounder mounted by most Crusaders.
Now, if you haven't heard our Crusader episode, you need to go back. It was basically cruiser tanks and Crusaders. I talk in depth about how I hate the 2-pounder gun.
The 2-pounder guns.
Yeah, if I had my choice between a 37 and a 2-pounder, always the 37. But the 2-pounder didn't even have an HE round. It was just shooting just steel at them.
Just regular steel.
When they were trying to kill artillery pieces, the Stuart could fire an HE and wipe them out. Even a machine gun nest.
You're
just shooting a steel round out. With this 2-pounder, it really severely limited their use against emplacements of anti-tank guns or even infantry. They're like, hey, these 2-pounder guns aren't doing anything. You need to bring up the Stuarts. And they're like, well, we ran them out of gas and they're sitting here. We'll go ahead and talk about its main drawback. I think I know what it is, though.
Yeah, the main drawback of the Stuart was its low fuel capacity and range. Its operational range was only about 75 miles cross country, and that was roughly half that of the Crusader tank.
Because they're using airplane fuel at that time, not the Cadillac, and the airplane fuel's got to be horrible mileage.
Oh, man, yeah.
But like on a full tank of gas out and they're doing cross country, they're only getting 75 miles to a tank.
At 36 miles an hour, that probably sucks it down pretty quick. When the U.S. Army joined the North African campaign in late 1942, Stuart tanks still formed a large part of its armor strength. After the disastrous Battle of Kasserine Pass, the U.S. quickly followed the British in disbanding most of their light tank battalions and subordinating the Stuarts to medium tank battalions, performing the traditional cavalry missions of scouting and screening.
Which what they were supposed to do.
That was their job,
yes. And, we were talking about Operation Torch in this Battle of Kasserine Pass. This is what we were talking about. They were going down Kasserine Pass, and they had M3 Lees, the M3 Stuarts, and the Shermans. Mm-hmm. And instead of using the Stuarts to go out and screen and scout and look for these anti-aircraft, these 88 guns and where the enemy's at, they were just driving alongside. They just did one big push and they just caught them out in the open and just tore them up really bad. Afterwards, they were like, oh, well, we're going to do away with this, Stuart. We're just going to make it be a scouting and a screening tank. Well, that's what it was made for.
And for the rest of the war, most U.S. tank battalions had 3 companies of M4 Shermans and 1 company of M3s or M5s/M5A1s.
Yeah, see, and that's the way it was supposed to be. Your Shermans were your muscle, and you had the Stuarts out there scouting and everything, kind of like how the Germans kind of had theirs set up. Like we talked about in the previous episode, the Panzer IIIs were supposed to go out first, and when they ran into something heavy, Then they brought up the Panzer IVs and the infantries and the artilleries and took care of it. What kind of stuff what kind of action did the Stuarts see in Europe?
Yeah, in Europe, Allied light tanks had to be given cavalry and infantry fire support roles since their main cannon armament could not compete with heavier enemy armored fighting vehicles. And just like we've talked about, they're undergunned. I mean, there's just no way around it.
There's just no way you can shoot a Tiger with a Stuart.
No.
But you weren't supposed to.
No, that's not what they were designed for.
Yeah.
In Normandy, Stuarts used the Collins improvised hedgerow cutter in France for Operation Cobra in the summer of 1944.
Have you seen the Stuart with the hedgerow cutter?
I don't think I've seen a picture of that yet.
And what's that? When Craig Moores helps develop that one site, Tank Encyclopedia?
Oh, yeah, the tankencyclopedia.com, yeah.
Yeah. He has the picture of that and a painting. We need to post that.
Okay,
When this episode comes out, we need to post that.
Yeah, we will.
And basically, it's just like the Shermans. They put the hedgerow cutters on the front of the Shermans.
Sweet.
But they found out these Stuarts didn't have any problem just running through these hedgerows, making big holes. So we'll get a picture of that so you guys can see it. It's actually very cool.
And on December 9th of 1944, the 759th Tank Battalion advanced on a hill near Bogheim, but was subjected to a counterattack by German forces, including a heavy self-propelled assault gun, a Jagdpanther or Tiger, which took over 100 direct hits at ranges as low as 75 yards with no appreciable damage.
I think we kind of talked about this. I think it was in our Jag Tiger episode when the Jag Tiger was into the town and they were just sitting there shooting at it. They hit this thing 100 times with this 35 millimeter gun. It was just bouncing. These guys in the Jag Tiger were like, keep shooting, boys.
Keep shooting it.
Yeah, you're not even
Keep trying.
Yeah. In World of Tanks, it says, we didn't scratch them.
Yeah.
We didn't even scratch them.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, okay. So after, 100 rounds, you might want to think about changing your tactics.
Trying something different.
Like calling in artillery support.
In January 1945, a report to General Eisenhower concluded that the Stuart was obsolete in every respect as a fighting tank. It just couldn't do anything against damaging any of the German tank.
Well, unfortunately, that's kind of how it goes.
True.
The Germans had the better armor. I mean, and if you talk to any historian, the Germans were building heavier, bigger tanks, like, the Jag Tiger, like we were talking about, the King Tiger, even the Mouse. I know people want us to do the Mouse episode.
Lord, I can imagine that'll be a popular one, I'm sure.
But in the Pacific, it was a different deal. At the end of the war,
at the
end, first,
yeah.
Go ahead and explain the Pacific combat history.
In the Pacific, the U.S. Army initially deployed 108 Stuart light tanks to the Philippines in September 1941, and that was equipping the U.S. Army's 194th and 192nd Tank Battalions, and both those battalions had 54 tanks each. The first U.S. tank versus tank combat to occur in World War II began on December 22nd, 1941, north of Des Moines, when the American tank battalions equipped with M3 light tanks engaged the Imperial Japanese Army 4th Tank Regiment and the 7th Tank Regiment. The Japan forces consisted of the 4th Tank Regiment, that was under Lieutenant Colonel Kamigaya, and they actually had 38 Type 95 light tanks, and the 7th Japan Tank Regiment under Colonel Sonada had 34 Type 89 medium tanks, 14 Type 95 light tanks, and 2 Type 97 medium tanks. The M3 light tank was superior to any Japanese tanks regarding to the armor and firepower. However, the Americans were not prepared for fighting, and they were confused with a sudden war. They tried counterattacks, but they could not stop the Japanese forces, who had naval gun, artillery support, and air supremacy.
What we're talking about, and what we're trying to give you a good example, the Japanese had 2 regiments. They had 38 of these Type 95 tanks. They had 34 of these Type 89s, 14 of these Type 95s, and 2 of these 97s. So you add all those up, it's getting close to, almost 100 tanks or over 100 tanks. So the Americans have better tanks, but they're brand new. These kids have never been in any kind of gunfight, and these are guys that are trained, battle hardened, had already seen, combat in China, even against the Russians, even in Korea, their whole invasion of Manchuria and stuff like that. So these are hardened guys, and they know how to do tank tactics. And they're getting backed up by their battleships using naval guns to shoot inland.
Sure.
And they're using coordinates, and they have the air superiority. So here's these guys that don't even know how to use these tanks, and they're out there, and they get just whipped by these Japanese tanks. Not because they're better, they're not used to the tactics, they're not combat hardened, and when you have, like the Yamamoto battleship shooting rounds 22 miles inland and hitting you're not going to do real good.
Kind of get your attention, yeah.
So, Russ, after World War II, we've talked about, in the beginning, the Japanese kind of beat us up because weren't familiar, and then we go on to the Satan tank and then the end of the war. After World War II, what kind of use did the Stuarts have?
Well, believe it or not, most South American countries received Stuarts after the war, including Brazil, which improved them greatly under the 70s X1A major upgrade.
Oh, the X1A. We've actually talked about this. Didn't they upgrade them to like a 90 mil? I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'll let you tell about it.
Called the Bernardini X1A in the 1970s, when the Brazilian Army staff asked itself what to do with its fleet of 350 M3A1 and M3A3 Stuarts acquired from the U.S. starting in 1942, and the rest in 1944 and 1945. The usual answer would have been to find the nearest scrapyard or dump them for future collectors and museums.
I would have been more than happy to take one.
Sure, I'd have taken one or two off their hands.
They had 350 of these, and they're just sitting around. And they're like, these are old tanks. We can either scrap them, try to sell them to museums or collectors, or we can upgrade them. So I know many had already been stored, retired, or cannibalized to keep about 100 operational. And then the Bernardini Industrial and Commerce Company of San Paulo. I actually have a friend on Facebook, San Paulo, and he's always sending me stuff. His dad's a police officer down there, so he's going to enjoy this part.
Yeah.
But this company out of San Paulo excelled in modernizing old military vehicles. It was the Stuart was a well-established tank, and this company was a well-established vehicle manufacturer. So when it earned its first contract for the modernization of like the M41 Walker Bulldog in service to the M41B and the M41C standards for these new Stuarts, most of the original hull and chassis were kept on the vehicle. They kept that. However, the superstructure was replaced by new sloped armored manufactured by the Bizel Company. This new armor assured protection on the frontal arc against 20 millimeter armor-piercing autocannon round. So they redid the front that would stop a 20 millimeter armor-piercing round, and then for mobility, in order to cope with the added weight, the original American gasoline engine was replaced by a 6-cylinder Saab diesel, developing a 280 horsepower. They took out a Cadillac and added a Saab diesel.
Go.
That's pretty good. And now the vehicle weighed about 15,000 kilograms. In addition, a new Volant spring suspension was designed to replace the old model. Range was improved. You take out the Cadillac motor and put in the Saab, you're going to get better mileage.
The diesel probably helped a little bit with that too.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. However, overall, the main armament changes were the most obvious. A brand new welded turret was with sloped armor was designed, fitted with a French DEFA D921A 90F1 90 millimeter. So when we said in the prior episodes, Stuart had a 90 millimeter gun, this is where it came from.
This is the tank.
If they had this 90 millimeter at the beginning of the war, that would have changed a bunch of things.
It sure would have.
As a low velocity gun, it nonetheless proved able to deal with like the Soviet built T-54s and 55s shown by the South Africans with their AML Red Ants. It could fire heat, HESH, and APFS DS rounds. This 90 millimeter could shoot some serious ammo and was capable of knocking out a T-54 and a T-55.
Sounds kind of like a badass for a
For a little bitty tank.
tank, yeah.
In addition, they had a brand new fire control system designed by DF Vescola, was installed in order to improve the first hit capability. And these M5s were still in active service and were documented as far as 1996. So
Incredible. It really is that they extended the life of them that long.
they improved the front armor, that it could take a 20 millimeter armor piercing hit, and they came up with this new welded turret, and they put a 90 millimeter gun on it. We will put some pictures of this out so you can see these.
They do exist, folks.
Yeah. So,
But my question is, maybe if we got any listeners out there that could give us an idea of where we can maybe find one of these in the future to go check out.
We have listeners in Brazil. If you know where one of these 90 millimeter Stuarts are, we would love to find out where it's at so we can tell people where to go. And if we ever get down to Brazil for Carnival, we have ran a little long, and I apologize, but we do really enjoy talking about flame tanks.
Flame tanks, Satan.
Yeah. Ooh, that's our devil episode. Oh no. But let's do our closing.
Yeah, as always, you can contact us through email, twotankersandcat@gmail.com. The best place to follow us and check out to see what we're doing all the time is on Facebook. Just do a search for Two Tankers and Cat podcast on Facebook, and you'll be able to find our page, and make sure you give us a like. We are getting out there on that quite a bit more than what we did when we started out. And the more we get the word out that our podcast is out there, the better off we'll be.
Especially, let's get out in North Dakota.
North Dakota, folks. Remember that. If you know anybody up there, have them download. So at least we've got one download from up there.
No doubt. Well, until next time, this is Charlie.
And this is Russell. Happy tanking, and have a great day.